Welcome back. Today we are attempting Edexcel Paper 1 due May 2023, obviously the microeconomics paper, and let's get right onto it with section A. So let's get started with section A. So what do? As soon as what is our normal strategy? As soon as we go to the question, we don't read the stem, we go straight to the question and then read the stem. So let's go about doing that. So with the reference to the information provided, explain one advantage. So my pen's don't work. So look for one advantage of the free market economy, and this is 4 marks. And remember, I said this in the section A tips video, if you ever get a 4-mark worded question, 1 mark is always, at least 1 mark is reserved for application. So you need to make sure, where's the application going to come from? It's going to come from this, so the stem you've been given. So let's have a read of this as well. So the question is asking us the advantage of the free market economy, and then we've got mention of the command economy. The Cuban government will allow private businesses to operate in most fields, some sort of the economy, create jobs. Okay, so basically, what's the stem telling us? The Cuban economy, the Cuban government is now moving from a command. And just a bit of revision if you do not remember, command economy, the resources are allocated by the state and no markets exist, whereas a free market economy, the resources are allocated by the price mechanism, which we say leads to eventually an efficient allocation of resources. So the question's basically asking us, give an advantage of the free market economy over the command economy. And this has a really good link to a different part of the spec, which is nationalisation versus privatisation. It's a really good 25 marker, 15 marker you can get at Edexcel, and it's a good one to prep for. But one of the major advantages of privatising a firm, so moving a firm from the public sector to the private sector, so basically from being government owned to now a private businessman owning it, is that when a firm is privatised, the firm regains its profit incentive. As we know, the classic economic assumption is that all firms have a profit incentive and want to profit maximize. But when a firm is controlled by the government, when it's getting funded by taxpayers' money, they lose that profit incentive. Why? Because they chase other objectives. They want to be actively efficient. They want to provide as much welfare to society as possible. Therefore, they don't have that core objective of profit maximizing. Then what happens? When they don't have that objective of profit maximizing, costs increase, costs spiral out of control, and basically the firm becomes very inefficient. And of course, with high costs, eventually that is going to be translated onto consumers with higher prices. But how would I word my answer to this question? So I'd say the Cuban move from a command economy to a free market economy is positive, as E.G will help jumpstart the economy and create new jobs. And why is that? As there is now a profit incentive, meaning firms have to cut costs and become more efficient, and this leads to lower prices for consumers. And there's also other points you can talk about, like more consumer choice, because there's more goods in the market, there's more firms in the market. You don't want better quality since there's more firms in the market, and there's now an incentive to invest into things like dynamic efficiency. As in when it's controlled by the state, when it's controlled by the government, they're not very dynamically efficient. Why? There's no competition, there's no need to innovate. Whereas when they're in the free market economy, they're competing with other firms. Therefore, there's more incentive for these firms to innovate and make their product better, which of course, at the end of the day, leads to better outcomes for consumers. And that would score you the 4 marks on this question. So moving on to the next question, which is a multiple choice, still on number 1, so still 1 of the 5 marks. So, which of the following economic thinkers supported the idea of the command economy? So this looks like quite an easy question, and let's get on with it. Process of elimination. So Adam Smith is definitely not one of these. So which of the following economic thinkers supported the idea of the command economy? So Adam Smith, of course, did not support the idea of the command economy. He was a very free market economist. He made the invisible hand. So invisible hand very much contradicts the command economy. And Hayek as well. I don't know whether I'm pronouncing that right, but he was also a big free market economist. So these first 2 are definitely wrong. We have John Maynard Keynes, who founded Keynesian economics, obviously a very influential figure. But his strategy was, during recessions, we want the government to spend lots of money to get us out of the recession. Although he did believe in state control, it was more a mixed economy rather than a outright command economy. So it would, and that's the one I probably believe students would get most confused on. It'd be between these 2 pretty much. But yeah, it would not be Keynesian economics, and Karl Marx did believe in the command economy. So it would in fact be D. Okay, that is question 1 done, and I just had to get 5 marks on question 1. Let's move on to question 2. So, like I always do, let's get straight on with the question. So, it's calculate 2 marks. Calculate the opportunity cost of the decision by the farmer to harvest 6 units of wheat. So 6 units of wheat, and looks like we've got a PPF. So 6 units of wheat this year at point Y. So movement of point X to point Y. So the question is essentially asking us the movement from point X to point Y. So we start at point X and then we are moving to point Y. So what changes? What's the opportunity cost for moving from point X to point Y? And let's just write this out. So opportunity cost X to Y. So let's see, what is the opportunity cost? So the farmer is of course moving to point Y since he wants more wheat, and he's getting he's getting 2 more wheat by producing at point Y. But what's the opportunity cost? So what does he lose out by producing 2 more wheat? He loses out on 1 oat. So by producing 2 more wheat, because the farmer's main objective is to produce these 2 more wheat. But what does he lose out on by producing these 2 more wheat? Is that 1 oat. So the opportunity cost would equal to 1 oat, not oats, 1 oat. And just for the second mark here, I am going to also write by moving from point X to point Y, the farmer does also gain 2 units of wheat. And that would be enough to score you 2 out of 2 there. Let's move on to the next question. So it's an explain question and it's 2 marks. Explain the impact on efficiency of producing at point W, and as I can remember, point W is a point inside the PPF in the following year. So it's basically asking you, what is the impact on efficiency by producing at a point inside the PPF? Of course, if you remember back to PPFs, it's a very early topic, but points along the PPF are classed as productively efficient. Any points inside the PPF are classed, of course, as productively inefficient. Why? As we're not using our resources to the maximum extent, and the points outside of PPF are just classed as simply impossible. So let's write this down. So explain the impact on efficiency by producing at point W. So this would be productively inefficient, and is, remember, 2 marks explain question. So you're going to have to give a reason. Why is it productively inefficient? As not as I'm going to say as the spare capacity, the spare capacity slash not using resources to maximum, not using resources to maximum. So productively inefficient as there's still some spare capacity slash we're not using our resources to the maximum extent. Basically we're not producing the maximum amount, and that would be enough to get you 2 marks there on an explain question. Always remember, so that is our point, but then since it's explain, you always need to give basically like a chain of analysis a reason. So that is 4 out of 5 marks bagged. Remember, your section is 5 5-mark questions, so there's going to be 1 mark here, which is a multiple choice. Let's have a shot at this. So which of the following is most likely to help the farmer reach point Z? And if I remember correctly, point Z is the point which said was impossible. So the only way we can reach this, so it's impossible currently, but the only way the farmer can reach this point if something causes the PPF to shift outwards. So we would need an increase in the maximum possible potential of wheat production and oats. So the question is basically asking us, this can give us lots of factors, and which one would actually cause the PPF to shift outwards. So let's have a read of these. So an increase in the investment of milk production machinery. Now this is about wheat and oats. So an increase in the milk production machinery would probably not help shift the PPF out, so it's not going to be part A. B, so an increase in investment in modern farming technology. I would say this is going to shift the PPF out. Why? Since if we invest in modern farming technology, it might make us more efficient, for example, meaning we can harvest more wheat and more oats. And if we can harvest more, remember, what is a PPF? It's a production possibility frontier, and it shows the maximum output of those goods. So if we can harvest more, it means the maximum output is higher, meaning that the PPF will shift outwards. So B would be correct, but let's check the last 2 just for revision's sake. An increase in demand for wheat. PPF, of course, does not show demand, so that would not be one of the factors. An increase in price of oats, that would also not help the farmers because PPF has nothing to do with the price. So by the process of elimination, the answer would be B, and it's basically saying the factor that would cause a shift out of the PPF is investment in modern farming technology. And that is 5 out of 5 marks bagged for question 2. Let's move on to question 3. So the likely income elasticity of demand, or some of you may know as YED, or for a luxury good is, and this is a bit of a content knowledge test. So what is YED? How do you calculate YED? It's percentage change in quantity demanded divided by percentage change in income. Now in this category there are 2 types of goods. There are luxury goods and normal goods or necessities. Now let's think about the formula. I'm going to give you the answer. I'm going to explain why the answer makes sense. As in the exam, it's very likely you're going to get a PD, YED, XED question, and if you can understand why the answer is the answer, you'll be able to remember it. It's not just about relying on your recall to remember, oh, this PD value means this. Is if you fully understand the formula, understand why a positive PD value means this, a negative PD value means that. It means in your exam, you're basically foolproof. You can basically always pick up the marks without having to rely on your recall. But let's think about this. So a necessity good. And let's think about how changes in income affect it. So if we have an increase in income, what is the percentage change in quantity demanded of necessity goods going to be? So if you get a pay rise from 30,000 to 33,000, a 10% pay rise, are you likely to go and buy more toothpaste, more bread, more milk? Not really. Maybe you'll buy, instead of buying one loaf of bread, you buy two because you can afford it. But the quantity demanded will increase ever so slightly with an increase in income when we talk about necessity goods, since usually people already buy their necessities and buy how much they need. Whereas on the opposite side of the spectrum, if you think about luxury goods, so we have an increase in income. So if our income's increased from 30,000 to 33,000, how much more is our quantity demanded likely to increase? Our quantity demanded is likely to increase quite a lot more, much more, since when we get a pay rise, we want to spend, instead of spending on more bread and milk, we want to buy like a nice watch, a nice car, for example. Now let's put a value on that. So for example, a 10% rise in income might lead to a 30% increase in quantity demanded of luxury goods. So what value does that give us? That gives us a positive 3 XED value. And now let's look at these XED values, sorry, not XED value, YED values, and which one, and there's only one positive one here, and that means D would actually be the answer. So the rule is basically greater than 1 YED value is a luxury good, between 0 and positive 1, this for example, this would be a necessity good or a normal good. Just like we were speaking here, so like I said, an increase in incomes isn't going to massively increase the demand for necessity goods, it might slightly. And then if YD is negative, there's also an other distinction as well. So YED, so negative YED means it's an inferior good. So what actually is an inferior good? If you remember back to the definition, when incomes rise, demand falls, and when incomes fall, demand rises. So for example, it's like buying Asda branded baked beans instead of like Heinz baked beans. And of course, these two would be examples of inferior goods due to the negative YED. Moving on to the next question. So it looks like we have a diagram question, 4 marks here. So draw the short run profit maximizing equilibrium of a loss-making luxury brownie baker, and small local bakeries have many characteristics of monopolistic competition. So loss-making monopolistic competition diagram. And remember, monopolistic competition is the exact same diagram as a monopoly diagram. So that's a very easy one to remember. So let's get started with labeling up the axes. So it's price here. You can put cost revenue. It is technically a cost revenue diagram, but price also works. I think quantity on your y-axis. And then let's get started with the curves. But the main thing here, so what is going to be how do we show that it's loss making? Remember, it's profit maximizing, but we show it's loss making by AC has to be above our AR curve. So usually I draw AR, MR, but to show it's loss making, I'm going to draw the AC first just to make sure it's above. So nice and high AC, and just make sure the only thing you need to do is make sure your AR does not touch your AC, and it will mean that is loss making. So something like this. So D equals AR, then just your MR, and then just your simple normal curves. MR, so your marginal revenue curve. MC, and still remember the same rule applies. Your MC still needs to intersect AC at its lowest point, so something like that, but let's actually draw it out. So MC curve, and yeah, so now that's pretty much all the curves done. Now let's add on the points as asked us to do, which is the profit maximizing point. So where do we profit maximize? We profit maximize where MC equals MR, which is at this point here. Then what do you do from MC equals MR? You go up to your AR curve, and this will give you a profit maximizing price. So we go from MC equals MR, we go up, and this will now tell us our profit maximizing price, so P max. But now what do we need to still do? We need to find our costs. So how do we find our costs? We keep going up from that price. So we go from Q, so we'll go down, just label this Q max, but you keep going up from Q max until you hit your AC curve, and this will now tell us the costs. So now until we hit our AC curve, and now we go left. And now what does this box tell us? If usually this box would tell us something like super low profit, since our price is now here and our costs are here, what does this box tell us? This box is therefore telling us the losses we're making, since our costs are higher than our price. So if your costs are higher than your selling price, of course, for every single unit you sell, you are making a loss. And I'm just going to tell that to the examiner, of course. I'm going to say a loss and I'm going to just label it up like that. And that is all you would have to do to pick up those 4 marks. What are the main things here? What you're getting assessed on? Of course, your axes, then your curves. So making sure you've drawn the four curves, labeling your curves, and then the main thing here, because it's loss making, your AC just needs to be above your AR curve, and then of course just showing the box. And this is an example of a 4-mark question. You can literally get done in, if you've practiced enough, pretty much 30 seconds. A loss-making monopolistically competitive market diagram is one of the simplest questions you can get, and especially 4 marks. It's a blessing. And the main thing is, if you spend 30 seconds on this, you have a 3-minute 30 surplus for maybe your section B, your section C, and it's all about trying to be as efficient as possible in section A, meaning that in the later sections maybe you'll have a bit more extra time. Question 3 done, 5 marks bagged, and let's move on to question 4. So question 4, let's have a read of this. So with reference to the information provided, calculate percentage change. Your calculate question, 2 marks, in the price of an annual season ticket. And what is it giving us here? The annual season ticket for a train journey between London and Reading is planned to increase from 5,000 to 5,664. So we're calculating the percentage change in the price of an annual ticket. So how would we do that? Okay, so how would we calculate this? Of course, very simple percentage change. I've been asked to not spend too long on these since they're very easy questions. But of course, you'd calculate the change. What is a percentage change formula? You calculate the change on the top, and then you divide it by the original, which is 5,044 in this scenario, and times it by 100, which will give us our answer, which gives the answer of 12.3%. And let's move on to the second part of this question. So it's an explain question, and it's holding 2 marks. So explain the likely impact of an increase in the price of the season ticket on consumer surplus. So it's just referring to the increase in the price referred to here. So very simply, what is going to happen when prices increase with regards to consumer surplus? There's going to be a decrease in consumer surplus. I remember these 2 marks, so this is not enough for both marks. We need an explanation here. So decrease in consumer surplus as the gap between what consumers are willing to pay and the equilibrium market price will fall. So consumer surplus is essentially the difference between what consumers are willing to pay and what they actually pay. So if prices increase, it just means that consumer surplus is now smaller. Why? Since there's less individuals in that gap. And of course you can show it on a diagram here, and you could probably pick up both marks by showing it on a diagram, but it is a bit easy just writing out this simple definition. And that would be enough for the 2 marks, and let's move on to the last mark of this question. So it's a diagram question, and it's multiple choice. So which of the following areas represent the change in producer surplus? This is a good one. When a minimum price is imposed. So first thing to identify is where is the minimum price? Well, it actually shows you in this question, so that doesn't matter. And yeah, let's have a shot at this. Okay, let's start really simply. So it's asking us for the change in producer surplus when a minimum price is introduced. But where is the original surplus? The original surplus. So let's forget the minimum price, just the original surplus at equilibrium. So at E. So the original producer surplus, remember, is below the equilibrium price. So it would be this triangle here, this red triangle I've labelled, and that is the original producer surplus. Now, what is happening with regards to price? With the minimum price, the price is obviously increasing from PE to P1, so producer surplus is in fact going to increase. And where's a new area of producer surplus? It's basically this entire area now, basically the larger triangles below the minimum price. And remember, the question is asking us, very keyword, it's asking us the change in the producer surplus. So let's see which of these fit this category now. So FEP P1, so let's find FE, I do not know where E is. Yeah, where is he? Okay, FEPE P1. So that is saying this triangle here, that is in fact wrong. So yeah, so it definitely would not be here. And just for a bit of revision, what does FEPEP1 actually represent? It represents the change in consumer surplus, as before the equilibrium price is set, consumer surplus was this entire triangle, but then after the minimum price has been set, the consumer surplus has now decreased to that. So that was the change. So FEPP1, this is the change in consumer surplus after the minimum price. And then, so it's not A, so what is B? B is FM, where is M? I have no idea. FMP1. So that is, of course, so what does this represent, like we were just saying? FMP1 represents the consumer surplus after the minimum price has been implemented, which of course does not fit our criteria. And then we have C, which is PE, P1, which is exactly what we are looking for if you look at this now, since the question is asking us a change in the producer surplus when the minimum price is imposed, and this, in fact, this new area would be the change in the producer surplus, which is, so we're going to tick this and that would be the answer. But just for practice sakes, let's check the last one out. So then we have G, where is G? So G, I can't actually see the answer. So G, K, and P1. This is the entire triangle, and of course the main thing here is exam technique, looking at the wording. A lot of students probably did mess up on that, but the question is asking you for the change in the producer surplus, not the entire new triangle. So that would be the entire new producer surplus, and C, the right answer, would show us the change in the producer surplus. And that would be hard to get 5 out of 5 marks on question 4. Let's move on to question 5, which is a big graph. And let's see what it's asking us. So which of the following is the ratio, so asking a ratio, of public sector pay relative to private sector pay in 2022? This is asking us in 2022, and let's have a look at this. So we have 118, which is, so public sector to private sector is 114 to 118. So how do you convert this into a ratio? So 114 would be the 1, and then what would 118 be? Of course 118 is larger than 114, so what would we do? We do 118 divided by 114, which would give us 0.13, which would be our 35, which would be our answer. So of course, doing 118 divided by 114 would give us 0.35, which you round up to 0.4, which means the answer would be in fact B. And let's move on to the next part of the question. So it's a 4-mark question, which it looks quite big. So using the information provided and the concept of a monopsony, explains in an explain question why nurses in the public sector have lower wage rises than those in the private sector. So straight away, sounds like a very simple, just monopsony theory question. And let's have a look at the STEM. Over 90%, and this would obviously, like we always say, 1 mark reserved for application here. So you would obviously use that to get that 1 application mark. So over 90% of nurses work in the public sector. So 90% in the public sector. Nurses in the public sector have experienced wage rises lower than those in the private sector over the last 10 years. Okay, so I've defined a monopsony as one dominant buyer of labour in the market, and then I've given an example of the NHS. Of course, nurses in the public sector are employed by the NHS. And why do they have lower wage rises than those in the private sector? A big thing with this question is 4 marks in section A. Don't go too off topic. Don't go on to explain now, because if this was a 25-mark question, you'd probably go on to explain monopsonies have monopsony power. They use this monopsony power to exploit the workers with low wages, and you can explain that whole chain of analysis. But the question is specifically asking you why they have lower wage rises, and just try to be as focused to the question as possible, as you can write lots of chain of analysis about monopsonies, but in this question, there's only going to be around 1 to 2 marks to chains of analysis. So you need to keep that in mind. Remember, these questions are usually structured, the 4-mark questions, 2 knowledge, 1 application, and 1 analysis. So you need to make sure you're hitting those points and not just writing chains of analysis for the sake of it. Okay, so here I've just written, this means nurses have no other choice in the public sector, as there's no other firms to work for, so they have to expect their low wage rises. So that's pretty much a mark there, just explaining. And then I've picked up the 1 application mark, because of course this was an example, but the application mark you're going to pick up is going to be from this. So I literally just quoted it explicitly. Energy public sector experiences lower wage rises in the last 10 years than the private sector. So then I'm just going to finish off with 1 sentence on the private sector, just explaining why the private sector wage rises are higher, since of course, unlike the public sector where it's a monopsony, in the private sector there are multiple firms, so they have to be competitive, and one way they are competitive is wage rises. So I've just finished off by saying, however, in the private sector there are multiple firms, meaning to remain competitive in relation to other firms, they must offer pay rises. And that would be more than enough for 4 out of 4 marks there. The main thing I want to tell you to remember here is to remember the mark breakdown. 2 knowledge, 1 application, and 1 analysis. Do not just go on a rant with your chain of analysis. Like, we understand you will probably have that content knowledge, but it's not going to pick you up the marks. It's a waste of time. Remember, it's all about being efficient. But yeah, let's move on to the next part of this question, which is done. So that is section A done, and that's 5 out of 5 marks. And that is a quick little tutorial how to get 25 out of 25 on your 2023 paper 1 microeconomics.